So, thank you so much for coming, and thank you especially to Chris Huhne, Andrew Stunell, and David Laws for joining us. They are three of the four former Liberal Democrat MPs who negotiated the coalition agreement on the Liberal Democrat side, obviously. Chris Huhne was the Member of Parliament for Eastleigh from 2005 to 2013 and served as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change from 2010 to 2012. Andrew Stunell was now Lord Andrew Stunell was the Member of Parliament for Hazel Grove and from 1997 until 2015 and served as both Chief Whip and Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. And David Laws was member for Yeovil from 2001 to 2015 and served as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Minister of State for Schools, and Minister of State for the Cabinet Office. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you very much for Sam Rubenstein, our outgoing Speakers Officer, for organising this event, which we think is these three's first appearance together since 2016, not 2015, but still pretty good going. As always, please message your questions to me, Sam, or Joshin, and we will put them to the panel. I'm going to ask everyone to keep their answers just a little bit briefer than they might otherwise, because we do want to get through quite a few questions, because this event has had some considerable interest. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Sam for the first question.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Freddie, and thank you to our guests for coming here. I think the best place to start, of course, is in the decline of New Labour, the final months in the run-up to the 2010 election. And I'd like to ask, I mean, were you by that stage anticipating that it would be a hung parliament? Were you sort of preparing already for coalition negotiations? Of course, there hadn't been a hung parliament since '74, but were you expecting that you might end up in that sort of position? Let's start with David Laws.
Yes, I think we were. I mean, it did look as if Labour were on the way out. The economic circumstances were bad. Gordon Brown's leadership was not impressive. So it seemed pretty clear that Labour were going to get the boot at the election. But it didn't seem as if Cameron had the momentum to have an outright majority on his own. That's what the polls looked like. So we did do quite a bit of preparation as a team in the run-up to the election. And that was on the assumption that there would be a hung parliament. Although the central expectation of most of us, maybe not Chris, but most of us, was that we might end up in a sort of minority government situation rather than a fully fledged coalition.
Is that right, Chris? Was that?
No, I entirely agree with that. I mean, I had expected that we would have a hung parliament at some point in my remaining political life, and so I had been fairly confident that there would be a good chance of that happening in 2010, and that we needed to be very serious about preparing for it. And we did quite a lot of preparatory meetings before the election. We obviously then had thought through some of the options, but I think David's right. I think most people in the party thought that we would end up probably with a supply and confidence agreement for a minority government. And probably most people thought it would be with Labour rather than with the Tories. But of course, the electoral arithmetic is what the electoral arithmetic is on the night.
On that, obviously, there are certain people, especially in Labour, who might look back and say that we should have gone into coalition with Labour, that it was possible. Notably, Andrew Adonis would say that we, missed out on the chance of some great progressive alliance. Andrew is Andrew's colleague in the House of Lords, so maybe I'll put that to you. Was it possible for us to go into coalition with Labour, or is that a mistelling of history?
A mistelling of history. First of all, arithmetically, it would have been highly problematic. It would have needed the SNP, the DUP and Plaid, for instance, to be working, or at least not opposing, some kind of Labour, Liberal Democrat administration or whatever. Very, very difficult to see how that could have come together arithmetically. Politically, it turned out to be a non-starter. With Gordon Brown going, their negotiating team, in fact, consisted of people who thought they would be the next leader, who had very little interest in reaching an agreement with the Liberal Democrats, which had clearly, at the personal level, undermined their capacity to appeal to the activists in the Labour Party. And they also seem to carry with them memories of the Lib Lab Pact back in the 1979 period, when the Liberals of the day were completely pathetic. Let's be honest about it. In the deal that they did, I seem to remember that we got cheaper red diesel for farmers, and that was about it. And they seem to have the same approach to their negotiations with us. I think they were a bit surprised to find that we actually had some plans which were costable, affordable, and deliverable, and it just didn't fit their vision of what the deal would be, which is basically we would have been yes people for a continuing Brown administration.
I think that's right. If I could just add a couple of points, we had what I remember to be a very bad meeting with the Labour negotiating team on the Monday evening after the election, and then a rather better one on the Tuesday morning. I was very keen that we should try and keep Labour in play, not just because I thought it would probably be easier, given our progressive politics, to be in coalition with Labour than with the Tories, but also, of course, because our leverage absolutely depended on both sides thinking that it was possible that we could do a deal with the other one. And if either side, either the Conservatives or Labour, thought that there was really no alternative but for us to do a deal with them, then our negotiating leverage inevitably would be a lot less. So it was very much in our interest to keep Labour in play for as long as possible. And I think we rather regretted the fact that Gordon Brown stomped off and decided that he was not going to play ball any longer. But that it was certainly taken seriously. But the reality is, as Andrew says, the electoral arithmetic was extremely difficult. And I would simply add one other point to that, which is that we were under enormous pressure all the way through the negotiating period, from the civil service, from the Bank of England, saying, look, watch out for the markets. And the markets were behaving very badly. People don't remember, but for example, in the day after the general election, Greek bonds absolutely cratered. There was contagion going on affecting Spain. We have the second largest budget deficit in Europe after Ireland, and there was a lot of worry that that would affect us. And therefore, having a solid government with a reasonable majority was something that I think that we were aware of was important too, and that was not what was potentially possible with Labour.
So going into the actual negotiations, what does a negotiation at that level with those stakes look like? Who's the proverbial bad cop, and how does that agreement get thrashed out and become something that gets voted on by the various parties? David, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I think that both the Conservatives and ourselves had done quite a lot of thinking about what we wanted to get out of a coalition deal, how a government would operate, what our key bottom line issues were. And so we went pretty quickly into a fairly constructive negotiation with the Conservatives. And I think in a way it was easier for both of us mentally. We were both in opposition. We both had been campaigning in a sense to replace the government of the day. We'd both been thinking about the risks of a hung parliament. So we went pretty rapidly into a fairly detailed discussion of each policy area, where the Conservative side led on, different people on the Conservative side led on some issues, and the same with us. With Labour, it was a bit more difficult. I mean, not only because I think some of their negotiating team and some senior Labour people really felt that the arithmetic wasn't there and were not sure whether coalition was the right route, but also that the mental dynamics of dealing with a party that's been in power for a very long period of time, you know, 13 years by 2010, was also very difficult. It was very difficult for many of the Labour members of their team to easily concede a sort of parity of esteem in the negotiation. It was extremely tough for them to agree to amend their government's policies in any way. The nature of the discussions and the degree of constructive interaction was very different between the two sides. And Labour really hadn't thought out what a coalition discussion would look like. I don't think that they really expected to be there. They probably thought they were going to do worse in the election. And for those reasons, the talks with the Conservatives were really quite different in their nature.
Can I just add one thing as well, which I think is really important in terms of the mood music? I remember waking up on Tuesday morning, but it's just slightly before Gordon Brown's resignation, and listening to the Today programme and hearing David Blunkett, closely followed by other reported Labour leaders, saying there was no way Labour should do a coalition agreement. So behind the scenes, or not behind our scenes, but actually out in public, there was senior Labour big hitters saying Labour needs to get out of government and should not do a deal. And I think that, you know, we were aware, obviously, of that too.
Speaking of the sort of nitty gritty of the negotiations, obviously there were a number of Liberal Democrats in the cabinet. Chris, you yourself were Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change before Ed Davey took over the role. But none of the great offices of state went to Liberal Democrats. So was there a push, you know, was there one you were trying to get, or were you happy with Deputy PM for Nick?
Can I make a point about this? Because I think it's very important that people don't understand how the negotiations worked. The three of us were actually responsible for negotiating the coalition agreement, which was effectively the policy document. The negotiations over people were dealt with between Nick and David Cameron directly. And I think one of the, I mean, there were some connections there, and David may, as obviously very close to Nick, may have been more informed about it than I was. But the first I knew, for example, that we were going to be offered the department that was responsible for student tuition fees, which was BIS, and the department that was responsible for our other policy U-turn, which was energy and climate change, was when Nick rang me up and said, I'd like you to be Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. And you know, then it went into a conversation of, so what else is going on? And so the two parts of the negotiation were kept separately. And it was that at that point, with that conversation with Nick, that I thought, this is dangerous, because, you know, the two people jobs that we've been offered in government just happen to be both responsible for what we had just negotiated in the coalition agreement as being perceived to be substantial changes from party positions.
Yeah, I would say we underinvested in thinking about posts, and it might seem a strange thing to say or admit, but in our sort of preparation for the negotiations, I think we were actually advised by some other coalition parties in other parts of Europe that you had to really focus on your policy ask during the negotiations. You shouldn't just focus on jobs. There was a risk, of course, if some of the people in the negotiating room thought they might end up or knew they might end up in particular positions, then they might be obsessed with negotiating their portfolio interests rather than other people's. So Chris is right that we didn't discuss that at all with our counterparts. And this was left largely to Nick and Cameron slicing it up. And some of it, I think, was obvious. You know, Vince had to have a senior economic portfolio. He didn't really want to be number two to George Osborne. We had to have the environment, the climate change department, because it's a very big priority for the Lib Dems. But I don't think we thought, and I think we were also interested in posts that would be powerful. So we ended up with the Deputy Prime Minister and Chief Secretary with two posts that were genuinely extremely powerful. And particularly once we had a quad process in which two of the four people in the quad were Lib Dems. The problem was that our two most powerful posts were both deputy posts, Deputy Prime Minister and essentially what became Deputy Chancellor. And so all the big moments, Prime Minister's questions standing on, the door of number 10, delivering the budget, those all turned out to be presentational opportunities for the Conservative Party, not for us. And when we were thinking about what would happen in 2015, if there was a second coalition, we did think much more about key posts that we would take, whether we would take the Education Department. I think we would also have made a grab for the Treasury position then. I think that we were too focused in some ways on policy to the exclusion of posts and to the exclusion of communicating our role in the coalition in 2010. Andrew, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I was certainly somebody who emphasised very strongly that we needed to put policy in front of posts. And my experience seeing it in balance of power in local authorities around the country is that it's very, very easy to be seduced into being bought off essentially by saying, well, why don't you have this job? And by the way, your policy agenda is shrunk. And one of the outstanding things about the coalition agreement was it was policy led. I mean, it surprised a great many people, but it was policy led. And at least until we ran out of steam after 3 years, it provided a very active and quite reforming government. I agree actually with what both David and Chris have said, that we didn't think about it or talk about it at all. I think Danny played a much more active role of the four of us in linking with Nick on those topics. And should we have done more? I don't know. I mean, we did discuss, outside of the four, we did discuss, was it better to have all the ministers in one department? Was it better to have ministers spread across? Was it better, etc., etc.? There are different configurations, and European experience offered different examples of both success and failure with both of those. I mean, for instance, you could have completely filled up the Environment Department or the Education Department, but of course, once you get exclusive control of one department, unless it's the Treasury, you are then absolutely going to be in a blackmail or bartering situation for the rest of the coalition period, just desperately defending your particular policy area against everything else. One advantage of the spread that we had is that, if you like, we had an investment and an eye and an ear in each of the policy areas. And I think that was ultimately a strength, given that we're a very junior, small party in a very big numerical coalition. I think there are 5 Tory MPs for every 1 Liberal Democrat MP. So, yeah, an uphill struggle.
I think it's worth just sort of stepping back a minute and asking how you define a good negotiation. What has gone right, what has gone wrong in retrospect. And in a way, it's quite difficult because, first of all, if you look at things that don't happen, perhaps because the negotiation over the coalition agreement was really quite good, lots of things you're constantly thinking, what could go wrong? How could the Tories actually use this? Is there a loophole which they could exploit, and so forth? And you're trying to close those things off. So, for example, with the alternative vote referendum, we had insisted on a post-legislative referendum, which meant the legislation had to go through the Commons first, because if we'd agreed an alternative vote referendum and then just relied on the Tories to deliver afterwards, probably exactly the same thing would have happened as happened in the commitment to reform of the House of Lords, which is that the votes weren't there and therefore the Tories basically reneged on it. So if you look at the coalition agreement, there is a lot of closing off of loopholes, which to my mind is good negotiation. What I think, if you then ask me, well, what do I regret about the period in government and what could we have done in the negotiations to avoid that, then I think actually we should have had the AV referendum immediately after the summer and got the legislation through very quickly. Could we have envisaged that in the negotiation? I'm not sure. I think that's something you can only do in government. I think one of the things that I regret is the fact that we went too far too fast in the first 2 years on the cuts on public expenditure and austerity. And again, can you really spell that out in the coalition agreement, or is that something that you do when you get to the public expenditure round? And that's again in government, not in the negotiations per se. And then the third thing, which I really regret, is the fact, and maybe we could have envisaged this and got it in the negotiations, I don't know. But if you look at the weight of the public expenditure cuts, they were overwhelmingly on benefits. And within the benefit package, they were exclusively on those of working age. So basically the Tories went into the negotiation with a commitment to preserve all the benefits offered to old age pensioners, which included warmer homes discount being drawn by expats in Spain for winter fuel allowance. Absolutely crazy. But we completely ring-fenced all that because the Tories wanted to protect every single benefit going to a pensioner. Now, that actually meant that all these very severe benefit cuts were on people of working age. And that, to my mind, was unfair, wrong. And could we have done something and envisaged doing that in the negotiation? I don't know. But certainly that's something that, again, happened in government. And I think the big difference between Westminster government and the local government negotiations that we had taken as our paradigm in our preparations, of course, is that stuff happens to a much greater extent at a Westminster level of government than it does at a local authority level of government. Stuff happens in local authorities too, but for Westminster, stuff happens in a very big way, and events determine what's going to happen, and you have to go on reacting. So there is a greater limit to the extent to which you can actually envisage everything that is likely to happen in a coalition agreement. So people also matter more, and places, posts matter more.
So, Chris, you touched on sort of regrets. I'm interested to hear from Andrew first, and then from David. What sort of regrets do you have? What could you have done in the negotiations that maybe would have made the next 5 years a little bit easier and been better for the Lib Dems approval ratings overall?
Well, leaving the Lib Dems approval rating out of it for the moment, I'll come to that in a second. But yes, my regret is that in cutting expenditure, we cut capital expenditure. And as somebody was a minister in the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government, the effect of that was that 18 months later, there were no houses being built. And the failure to continue a housing programme was wrong in principle, and it had practical outcomes as well, because the government was strongly, it was highly exercised by what to do about that, and most of the solutions that were being put forward, largely by George Osborne, were actually making the problem worse, not better. So I think that was, if you like, a strategic error in terms of infrastructure. And it's a very easy one to make, of course, because it appears to be harmless to row back on capital spend, which doesn't seem to affect people in the same way. Well, I suppose anybody who lived through that parliament has got to say that something went wrong with tuition fees, but there's a lot of different views about what it was that went wrong. I see there's a question on the chat, which maybe is the most relevant one, which is, why did we ever sign the pledge in the first place? And I would say, in my own defence, that I was certainly told very strongly at the time that I was the final MP to sign, although Vince claims...
No, that was me.
Yeah, exactly. I think quite a lot of us were the final MP to sign, and very much hoped that our feet wouldn't be held to the fire. And of course, the coalition agreement was hinged on what the Brown Review would produce. And it also didn't take account of what, to me, was a very important factor in the event, which is who held that policy in cabinet? And the answer was Vince Cable. So Vince, being a very skilled negotiator, negotiated an excellent deal, and came back and said, well, we've got a very good deal. What's wrong with it? And of course, it's proved politically catastrophic, but not necessarily all that wrong in practical political terms. I can say as an MP, I had quite a lot of students asking if they could transfer to the new scheme because it was better for them. So yeah, it was a bad choice, and whether it was made worse by the fact that we had a skilled negotiator developing a policy, he should have been told, perhaps he was told, he should have been told, this is a negotiation designed to fail. And it's a point which sometimes is missed in this. You can go into negotiations intending that they're unsuccessful. And if Vince had gone into that negotiation intending to get a deal that he couldn't recommend to anybody, we'd have been in a much better position to abstain or vote against or do any of the things we should have done. But my take on that may be not shared by my fellow panelists.
Well, I think student tuition fees is obviously an enormously important one. And I still don't know, and I wasn't close enough to it through the government negotiations once we'd had the Brown report to know quite what was going on. But I mean, I still find it surprising that we couldn't have a graduate tax instead, frankly, because that's actually what we ended up with. We still called it student tuition fees, but a little bit of politics in the final analysis could have made the whole thing much, much easier from a Lib Dems point of view. And the bizarre thing is when parties drop pledges or change them and don't deliver exactly what their supporters wanted, when do they get punished and when don't they? Because there are many, many examples, including Labour, obviously, who did a U-turn on student tuition fees in the first place and actually introduced them and then didn't get punished. But we got enormously punished. So I think it's very, very difficult to know exactly what is the third rail when it comes to a pledge that you make when it can be really used against you by your opponents, and that one certainly was very difficult.
Yeah. So before I mean, the two things I would like to pick out as things that we made mistakes on were the presentation of the Lib Dem role within government and then tuition fees. But before I come on to those two issues, I mean, I'll just say that I think that going into coalition as a smaller party at a time of economic austerity was always going to have a very big impact on our public opinion poll ratings and our prospects of doing well at the next general election. We knew that, and actually that's one of the reasons why voting reform had to be such a priority for us. We'd looked at the experience of smaller coalition parties in government across Europe in the previous 20 years, and they almost all lost half of their support the moment they went into coalition, whatever else was going on. So we knew it would be challenging. We actually delivered, I think, a huge number of really good things that I'm incredibly proud of during the coalition period. I'm not sure that it would have been easy to win the AV vote, whatever the timing had been. Some people are saying we should have held it later, some earlier. I certainly don't agree with the people who say it should have come later. But I think it would have been difficult to win with the other two parties for their own different reasons, strongly against it. The two mistakes I think we made, which might have made a bit of a difference, but probably wouldn't have transformed our prospects in 2015, were firstly that we didn't really successfully coalitionize the image of the government. You know, when we had rows with the Tories, everyone used to accuse us of bickering. When we didn't have rows, everybody said, what's happened to the Lib Dems? This is just a Tory-run government. And because we were so focused on policy in 2010, we actually didn't really pay enough attention to how difficult it is as a smaller coalition party to gain the credit for the good things you're doing. It's too easy for those to be picked up by the bigger party and for you simply to disappear into government. And by having two deputies in the really powerful positions we had, and then occupying a number of other departments which were important, but not necessarily having the same political profile, made our job, I think, much more difficult. And then, of course, there was tuition fees. And the truth about this is that we went into 2010 with very different views within the party about whether we should ever have had that policy. I strongly argued for it to be dumped before 2010. I thought spending money abolishing tuition fees was not the educational priority of the country at all, that all of our money should go into investing early and targeting funding to things like the pupil premium, to invest in helping young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to do better. And although tuition fees, raising tuition fees was never going to be popular, it wasn't really a key issue in terms of university access. And most of the people who go on to university then as now are from higher income backgrounds who aren't the primary focus of improving education in this country. So we went into the negotiations and the election with really many people in the leadership wanting to dump or downgrade that policy. We'd already said we'd phase fees out over 2 parliaments. And then another wing of the party strongly believed in free tuition and also recognised that this was important in some of the seats that we held, particularly university seats. So we went in a rather kind of difficult position, and some of us felt that we could prioritise things like the pupil premium and downgrade our priority of cutting tuition fees in the talks. Now, we might have just about got away with that if we'd had a coherent position across the party. But given that when it came to the final vote on tuition fees, we actually managed to vote in 3 different directions, abstaining, voting for, and voting against. I mean, it was a complete and utter mess. And what we agreed in the coalition talks did not necessarily bind our hands in government. It didn't bind Vince's hands or Nick's or mine or Chris's. It said the Lib Dems will be free to abstain on tuition fees if they don't agree with government policy. Of course, the irony is that we were part of the government and we had the Secretary of State who was going to set the policy. So we could still have fixed it after the negotiations. But if I'm honest, I think with the benefit of hindsight, we made, including me, a bad mistake during the negotiations in not following through on what I think was implicit in our planning assumption before the talks, which was that probably we would end up freezing tuition fees and stopping an increase rather than successfully abolishing them. And if we had done that, I think it would have made our position much easier. We still wouldn't have delivered the pledge to phase them out, but we wouldn't have had the difficulty of explaining going from phasing them out to tripling them. And we would have found it much easier to keep our party united and present a united position to the electorate. So I think, this was a terrible mess of a policy. It absolutely, in my view, should have been dumped before 2010. I was very angry with the party for not doing so, frustrated actually that Nick didn't have more of a fight before 2010 with the party to try and change it. But then the party having made that decision, I think that some of us who are very angry about it should probably have accepted that what that meant is that we couldn't support an increase in fees in government. We didn't do that, and that was a real mess. Whether it really made a huge difference in 2015, I don't know, but it certainly handed our opponents a huge club to beat us over the head with. And it would be idiotic to say that we would do things in the same way again, because it was not a happy process for any of us, and it damaged a lot else that we achieved in government.
Yeah, I think can I add one thing? I think that comes back to the previous discussion we were having about posts and policy, because David mentioned obviously that Vince was the minister responsible for sorting out the tuition fees issue, and therefore the fact that we had gone into the negotiations with one set of discussions about posts, which ended up with Vince being responsible for the tuition fees, but unbeknownst to us, who were negotiating what was in the coalition agreement, I think that again shows you that posts are really rather important, and that this was, in my view, a bit of a Tory trap that we walked into.
You mentioned the failure to coalitionize the presentation of the government, and how perhaps too simplistically, but the Tories took credit for the successes, and a lot of the blame went on Liberal Democrats, especially on, say, tuition fees. Was there ever any serious talk of fighting the 2015 election with an electoral pact of any description with the Conservative Party? Obviously, as it turned out, the Conservative Party targeted us quite ruthlessly. But David, perhaps, was there anything that any particular talk of that, say, in 2014?
Not in 2014. I mean, in 2011, after the omnishambles budget, where Osborne had presented that budget where everything unravelled and went wrong, it was very clear that he and Cameron thought there was a serious risk that they were going to lose the next general election. The economy was in a difficult position. The Eurozone was a mess. Inflation was very high. And I had a meeting with George Osborne in the Treasury that year where he said to me, look, let's have in 2015 a coupon election where we will stand down in certain Lib Dem seats and you can stand down in ours. And essentially, we will have a sort of pact which will allow the coalition to continue in 2015. And I remember him saying, you know, David and I have done opposition. We'd never want to go back to the opposition backbenches. Whatever it takes, we want to stay in power, even if that's a sort of permanent coalition with the Lib Dems. And I obviously reported that back to Nick Clegg, who'd also had similar sort of suggestions made, I think, in a roundabout way by Cameron. And I think they repeated those types of suggestions again in maybe 2013 or early 2014, but just very informally. But both of us felt that, you know, turning ourselves into a party that was not going to stand in every particular seat, hitching ourselves to a policy bandwagon, a Tory bandwagon, when we didn't even know how that would be evolved in areas like Europe, would be really dangerous to us and would compromise the identity of the party. So we both gave, I think, very rapidly and very abruptly, and in the meetings where that was aired, a really clear signal that there would be no pacts or deals of that type. There were obviously informal talks about whether or not we would end up in a coalition after 2015. And I think that Cameron and Osborne always guessed that they would not get a majority and that would have to rely upon us again post 2015. But there were never any really serious discussions about some kind of electoral arrangement or coupon election.
And I think, you know, that would anybody who knows a little bit about Liberal Party history in the 1920s and 30s would take exactly the attitude that David quite rightly took. I think the party's identity would have been fundamentally compromised. It would have been extremely difficult. It would have split the party. We would have ended up with national liberals taking the coupon, independent liberals not taking the coupon. It would have been a complete mess.
Yeah, and it's one of those offers that when somebody makes it to you, you have to reject rather quickly, because if you hesitate for one moment, the risk is that, you know, your hesitation will be used forever against you.
We've spoken at some length about the problems with the coalition, but I wanted to ask, I mean, you know, looking back over the last 10 years, it was the most stable government or Conservative-led government of the last 10 years. Why do you think that is? And do you buy this idea that David Cameron was sort of more comfortable in bed with the Lib Dems than he was with some of his own backbenchers?
I think there's no doubt at all that he was. I remember Oliver Letwin saying to me in the first few months of 2015, you know, we would much rather be in coalition with you lot after the election than having to rely upon some of these headbangers on the Tory backbenches. So I think, it was more than that, because anybody would Cameron have preferred to govern with us or alone with a huge majority? Unquestionably alone with a big majority. He can't have enjoyed sharing power as he genuinely had to do. And particularly as I think we got better at it during the course of the coalition, you know, we began to understand far better how to check the Tories, how to get things in exchange for the things they wanted. And, you know, Cameron led a government where the inner cabinet was 4 people, 2 of whom were Lib Dems, and he couldn't do any big serious things unless he got our agreement. So I'm sure he would have much rather had a strong working majority of his own. But I think that, you know, he was pleased to have a working majority with us, and actually both parties, for their slightly different reasons, were determined to make coalition work, to show that a coalition could operate well. And at its best, I mean, it was not a kind of lowest common denominator type process where you sort of take all of each other's policies off the table and just end up implementing a very anemic type of program. I mean, the coalition achieved some very big things, and it made some very bold changes in areas that even the previous Labour government hadn't been able to do, on things like the pupil premium, on equal marriage, on overseas development expenditure, on the tax allowance, on the green agenda, on free school meals, on arguably more right-wing things like privatising the Royal Mail. I think it wasn't just a stable government, it was also a pretty radical government, and it was a much more socially inclusive one for the Liberal Democrat participation in it. It's true we had to do a few things on welfare and tax that none of us liked, but if you look at the distributional consequences of the coalition, what happened to different income deciles during that period, and then you look at what happened to those income deciles once the Conservatives governed on their own after 2015, you'll see that the graphs look totally different. The lower income earners were much better protected under the coalition, and the higher income earners did lose a significant chunk of their income. As soon as the Lib Dem participation went, the upper income earners were making no contribution to austerity at all, and the lowest earners were losing 8 or 9% of their incomes. So you can see in graph terms just the significance socially of having a coalition with the Lib Dems in it compared with Conservatives governing by themselves.
Ironically, all of this talk about coalitions and Liberal Democrats in coalition has an interesting level of relevance, given that in Wales, we govern with Labour in the Senate, and Kirsty Williams has obviously announced that she will not be standing again. So that actually takes, you know, sort of the last Liberal Democrat in national government. That's, you know, the end of that. So Andrew, you still sit in the House of Lords. You're still involved in legislation, amending and passing. So I was wondering, do you see a future for Liberal Democrats in national government over the next, say, 10 years? And how do we make our voice heard effectively on a national level? And by national, I mean both UK-wide, but also in the various national devolved administrations.
Okay, well, there's a nice simple question with a nice simple answer. I think we need to unpick that a little bit. I mean, legislation for the time being is entirely in the hands of Boris Johnson.
Sorry, Andrew, could you just talk up a little bit? I think you're a little bit quiet.
Okay, sorry about that. Is that an improvement? Okay, good. Yeah. So at the moment, any legislative changes we make in the House of Lords is being automatically and routinely reversed when it gets to the Commons. And we've had the largest majority in the Lords against a government bill for a very long time, with the internal market bill, which is their proposal to breach international law in specific and limited circumstances, of course. But of course, that'll be reversed in the Commons. So the role that we were performing between 2015 and the last general election of sending stuff back to a divided Commons, where sometimes the forces wearing the white hats could overwhelm the forces wearing the black hats, has stopped. The headbangers that Cameron was so afraid of are driving the whole process. So don't have too many expectations that I can change the course of history up until the next general election. But if you take the impact of COVID into account, if you take the impact of Brexit into account, and we don't know where that's going to be, and if you listen to some of the mutterings there still are in what's left of the moderates in the Conservative Party, indeed, the internal market bill might be an exact example of that. How many Conservatives actually believe that their party should be breaking international law? And there's a surprising slice in the dough. So in other words, what I'm saying is nothing is predictable in politics. None of us could have predicted the events following the general election of 2015, and none of us can foresee what the next 5 years, 10 years is going to produce. So I don't ever give up hope, but I also am extremely realistic about this, having been part of the preparatory teams for coalition ever since 1983, I think, was the first time I got involved in teams who were looking at this stuff. The one time when it actually happened, people aren't entirely sure we did the right thing anyway. So, no, I think there's, so let's go back to the more fundamental question, which is what are the Liberal Democrats for? And what we're for is making sure that people have a fair shout in life, not just in Cambridge or Stockport, which was where I am, but in Malawi and Singapore and anywhere. So we're an internationalist party, and we are a party which believes that there are ways of delivering success which have somehow eluded both those of a highly state-oriented system, whether you call it communism or socialism, or for that matter, a completely anarchic system of beggar my neighbour, which is generally where the Conservatives are going to. So, yeah, I think there's a big space, and Liberal Democrats can do it. Two of the things we did in the coalition, which nobody has noticed almost, is the devolution of power. Huge row this week between Andy Burnham and the government. Well, who is Andy Burnham? He's the mayor of Greater Manchester, which is now an authority which has a significant amount of money and policy to go at. And considering how unlikely it might be, in fact, both Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties in 2010 were, for different reasons, in favour of taking power out of Whitehall. And we actually did some. And I'm proud particularly of the work that we did on devolution. And I don't think we should overlook the stuff we did on the environment. Chris was being a bit modest about, getting the wrong end of the stick with the environment portfolio, but we absolutely transformed the energy market and the whole green agenda. And in 2015, of course, they started to cancel the whole lot. Zero carbon homes should have been, every home in Britain should be being built zero carbon now, cancelled in 2015. So yeah, we did some good stuff. There's more good stuff to do. And if we have a chance, I'm sure we'll be there doing it.
And on that point, and where we as a party go in the future, in the last leadership election between Layla Moran and Ed Davey, both of them made it pretty clear that they will not, under any circumstance, consider another coalition with the Conservative Party. Now, I can understand the sort of political expediency to saying that, but do you think that's a short-sighted approach? If the 2024 election produces an outcome similar to 2010, could another Lib Dem Tory coalition be on the cards? Chris?
Well, you have to say, if people are going into this election looking at it very much like a 97 election, or at least hoping that it might be a bit like a 97 election, then you will have the same sort of attitude that Paddy, our then leader, Paddy Ashdown, had towards Tony Blair, with the potential downsides, but also the potential upsides. And you never know, you might even have a Labour leader who, if he were to win big in an election, would do exactly what Jacinda Ardern is now saying in New Zealand, which is, despite having an overall majority under a PR system, she wants to potentially explore going into government with some of the smaller parties, in her case the Greens. So never say never in politics, but I think that if we were in a situation where we had an election result like the 2010 election result, then if you're being ruthlessly pragmatic and realistic about it, you have a choice either to go into an arrangement with the Conservatives, or you will have a minority Conservative government with a general election in fairly short order, in which you are likely to lose a lot of seats. So the real choice that you face in 2010 or in another similar circumstance, if that were to arise, would not be between some sunlit upland where you gamble off into the spring and with Labour and do lots of nice progressive things, which I would love, but actually where you either do a deal with the Conservatives and extract something hopefully good things and stop them from doing other nasty things, which is basically what we did. And David gave you the numbers on the deciles of income distribution, what we did during the coalition. Or alternatively, let's be realistic about it, you're going to look at a situation like February and October 1974, where you have a minority government, in that case it was Labour, that actually establishes itself with a substantial, with enough of a majority in the subsequent election, and we get hammered in the process. And we get hammered because we haven't been prepared to take decisions in government. So, you know, in politics is often a choice between two unpleasant alternatives, and the real decision you have to make is which is the less unpleasant, not whether it's actually fun and nice.
To talk about... Oh, sorry, Andrew, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I mean, obviously you've got us going now. We can talk for hours on this.
Could you try talk... Are you perhaps covering the microphone of your computer or something?
I sincerely hope not.
That's
I'm
better.
quite prepared to shout if I have to. The point I wanted to make is that when we get to the kind of choices that we had to make, and David made this point about losing seats, Chris has just made it, we knew we were in a very difficult position electorally if we went into coalition with the Conservatives. And we would have been in a different hard place if we'd gone into any kind of an agreement with Labour. There were people who would never support a party that backed Labour. There are people who would never support a party that backed the Conservatives. I use the word backed in inverted commas there. And we have to face that that's the case. We had a special conference in Birmingham before this coalition deal was signed off. And I've still got the speech I made then. And I started off by saying, we're going into a very dark place. And I don't think any of us who negotiated that deal imagined this was the way to get a majority Lib Dem government at the subsequent election. So if you like, it was for the national good, or perhaps as Chris has put it, out of national necessity. But I don't think that we in any way imagined that we were producing a glittering future for the Lib Dems in doing what we did.
Yeah, being a smaller party in a system like ours of first past the post, where, as Andrew says, basically half of our supporters have a second preference of Labour, and half of our supporters, it varies, you know, particular years, and it depends on how popular Labour and the Tories are, half of our supporters have a second preference of the Tories. You are going to find it very difficult, and first past the post will punish you disproportionately if you lose vote share, which is why the AV referendum was so important. One thing that did come up in the negotiations, and none of you you've all been too kind to ask, you know, were there some offers in the negotiations which you turned down? One of the things that did come up in the I'm not sure how serious it was from the Tory side, but they did say, well, why don't we guarantee to back AV, providing it's rolled up with their proposal for regular changes in constituency size, so that there would be absolutely always, you know, constituencies, which effectively is what they've now introduced. And we didn't discuss that. We brushed it off pretty rapidly. Partly because we felt that if you don't have natural communities within parliamentary constituencies, if you apply a cram down on the size of parliamentary constituencies, so they always have to be within whatever the percentage was of each other, you so limit your connection to natural communities that would be extremely difficult for us, historically, having built up through local government, through local support and so on. So we didn't discuss that, but that was an option that might potentially have got us AV. I mean, AV is not proportional representation. It's certainly not single transferable vote, which is what I want to see.
You sort of preempted my question there, actually, because obviously as a Liberal Democrat, a member of the Electoral Reform Society, I personally also want to see the single transferable vote. And to me, AV was a sort of big missed opportunity. But one of the stories you hear, perhaps apocryphally, in Lib Dem circles is that we turned down the opportunity for STV and council elections for the chance for the AV referendum on the national stage. David, is that true? And if so, could you talk a little bit more about where that might have come from, if it's not true, or how electoral and constitutional reform was discussed in the negotiations?
My recollection, Andrew may remember more about what we discussed on local electoral reform. We did think about doing something on that later on in the Parliament, because we thought it might be more acceptable to the Tories after national voting reform had been lost. But my recollection is during the coalition talks, we were almost wholly focused on voting reform for the Westminster Parliament. And the reason for that was very simple. That was the thing, the big prize that we thought would protect us potentially a bit from the consequences of having to go into a coalition and ensure fairer representation in the future. George Osborne and David Cameron would have leapt at the opportunity to trade off voting reform at Westminster for some local government voting reform, which they frankly couldn't care less about. They would have had a lot of problems with their councillors, but they would have regarded them as low-level fodder to be written off fairly rapidly if they could get rid of what they would have seen as the big threat of having a voting form for Westminster. I think the Conservative Party always wants to retain control of national government and would have seen local government as something they would happily have given us. So I don't think, Andrew, we discussed that a lot, but there was some discussion about that after voting for reform for Westminster went off the boil. And I think we also thought about whether we might try to put that on the agenda post 2015 if another coalition had occurred.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with David. Indeed, I was one of those who was most strongly saying don't mention local government when we came to voting reform, because it was the most obvious thing. If you go in with a big apple and a small apple and say, I want 2 apples, they say, well, you can have the small apple. And quite clearly, it was going to be the escape route for Tories in a tight spot. Look, we've offered it to you for local government. Why are you being so, etc. So we would quite deliberately, contrary to the point in the question, we were absolutely not. Don't mention the war, Daddy. I mean, that was absolutely it.
I think it does highlight, if I could just come back very quickly, Freddie, on your question, it does highlight the real conundrum about getting voting reform through, because we settled on this AV option because it was, the most limited reform, which we hoped wouldn't seem too threatening to some people who wanted the constituency link, which had some support within the Labour Party.
It was in their manifesto, David.
Of course, well, yeah, still had quite a lot of people in the Labour Party that didn't agree.
That's true.
It was in their manifesto. People in the Conservative Party might sign up to it. And so we went for this watered down, non-proportional system in order to get the support around it. But that turned out to be an impossibly complex solution to push with the public. And, when we went on the doorsteps trying to explain how AV would work and how you could come second in an election and yet be elected the MP, people just couldn't understand it at all. And then the campaign tried to turn it into something about, AV will make your MPs work harder. And I knew we'd lost the referendum, 5 days out from the election when we knocked on a Lib Dem supporting door just outside the Oval, on a door that always voted Lib Dem. And a woman said, look, I just can't stomach this AV voting reform stuff. I'm not going to vote on this. And our councillor said, oh, but you always vote Lib Dem and David Laws and everything. And she said, yeah, but I've read this leaflet saying that this will force our MPs to work harder, and I already think David Laws is working hard enough, so I'm going to go against it so that he doesn't have to have any more burdens put on him. And when I realised that we got a communications problem of that type, I mean, it was almost not worth bothering to discuss it on the doorsteps anymore. It was just too complicated to explain, whereas if we'd had a proportional system on the ballot paper, people could have understood that argument much more easily.
I remember very clearly, it was probably one of the first campaigns that I remember was the AV referendum, and could almost count it as my first ballot when I convinced my mother to vote for the AV referendum, but didn't manage to get my dad. We're out of time, but if I may ask one more question of you three before we go. When you went into these negotiations, the country was facing sort of a political and economic crisis. And frankly, a lot of people didn't expect the coalition to last. The ceremony in the Rose Garden, people thought it'd be over within a year. And then obviously there's the Fixed Terms Parliament Act. But in the end, I think it's probably fair to say it lasted and was far more stable than anyone expected, certainly in the popular imagination. When you went into these negotiations, did you think you were writing a document for 2, 3, or the full 5 years? And would you have done anything differently if you knew it was going to last for the full 5?
Yeah, so I definitely thought we were writing one for 5 years, partly because I thought that we would need to turn the economy round, show that we had dealt with the public finances and been in a position to do some nice things for the electorate before wanting to go back to the electorate. And I think that because the whole government was predicated on the basis of, you know, trying to sort out the public finances and turning the economy around, I think both the Conservatives and Lib Dems assumed this would be a 5-year parliament. Actually, I think Cameron and Osborne were not as confident as I would have been, because I think that they worried that at some stage, you know, we would dump them either because the party would get cold feet or we would see some opportunity to do so. So they were quite often asking Nick and me and others, you know, will this coalition go 5 years? But my view was that it would run the full term because it was in the self-interest of both parties to go long.
I think that was certainly my assumption as well. It would certainly go for at least 4, that there might be a break off in the last year before an election, but that it would certainly go to 4 or 5 years. But I come back to the point that the coalition agreement that we negotiated was, particularly the further away from it you got, increasingly it was important what was decided in government, and therefore the posts were important, and the way in which decisions were taken were important. So even the way in which key decisions were taken was different to what we had negotiated in the coalition agreement. The Quad does not appear in the coalition agreement. What actually appears in the coalition agreement is a coalition committee to resolve issues which are coming up between the two parties, and that may have been regarded as too cumbersome or whatever, I don't know, but the Quad basically took over from that cabinet committee, and that cabinet committee with a wider membership, including, as I remember, 50-50 membership, Conservative and Lib Dem, and all of the members of the Lib Dem members of the cabinet, that didn't meet. So look at what was actually in the agreement and look at what actually happened. And a lot of this is inevitable, that stuff happens that you can't envisage in an agreement. And you need to be able to trust the decision-making processes and the people and the positions therein.
Yeah, I would say we certainly saw the programme as being intended to last for 4 years, 5 years, whatever. Fixed Term Parliament Act of 5 years was one of those conversations which took about 2 minutes, because we said 4 years and they said, well, why not 5 years? And we said 5 years.
You're very quiet again, Andrew, I'm afraid.
I'm really sorry about why I'm so quiet. I can't. Anyway, yeah, I think the point that Chris has just mentioned is a correct one. What I would say is that I think my thread's actually disappearing. I think I'd perhaps better stop, as well as being faint. I think I've lost my thread of conversation there. My apologies.
I think that is all we have time for, unless, Sam, you have a quick fire question, but we've already gone over time.
Very, very quick, if I could just get, you know, a sentence from each of you, very straightforwardly. If you could go back in time, would you do it all again?
Absolutely, I would. In spite of losing my seat at the end of it. I mean, I think that it was the right thing for the country, but it was also the first time, you know, for decades that the Liberal Democrats have been able to make a major impact on the policies of the country for the better. the key issue is, you know, how long will it take the party to recover to be able to make an impact again? But I'd far rather have the chance to do the things we did in government than twiddle our thumbs on the opposition benches for another decade.
Yes, I would do it again. I would insist on having a good night's sleep beforehand. And I think that it would have been a better agreement if we hadn't all been so tired and so desperate to reach an agreement very quickly. But there are lots of learning points. We would do it again, but I'm sure we would do it differently. I'm also quite sure that people would not entrust us with doing it again. We'd have a more diverse and representative team, and I'm sure it'd be a far better agreement when it comes. Maybe 5 years? No. 10 years? Yeah, possibly. 15 years? Very likely.
Yes, I would certainly do it again. I don't think we had any real option in those circumstances, and I think that we were able to do a lot of good things in government, and we were able to stop a lot of bad things in government, and for all of those reasons it was worth doing. Andrew is absolutely right. We wouldn't have clearly done it in exactly the same way. One of the things which I very much hope that the next negotiating team for the Lib Dems has the opportunity to do is to research more thoroughly on what the real weak spots and political sensitivities are of the people we're negotiating with. And that was something that we didn't do quite enough of in the run up to that election. And we certainly didn't do enough of, because we didn't think it was very likely, on the Conservatives. But the Conservatives did it on us. They knew exactly what our weak spots were on both tuition fees and on nuclear power, and they took pretty ruthless advantage of the fact that the negotiations were bifurcated between policy negotiation and, in my view, the posts negotiation. And as a result, they got us in a trap on the tuition fees, which I think we could have got out of in government, but would have been difficult, and we wriggled, and as a result we were impaled rather more thoroughly by coalition than we might otherwise have been.
By the way, I think it was more our mistakes before 2010 and in the negotiations than Tory cleverness over tuition fees. I think Chris is giving them too much credit for having some clever strategy. I think actually most of the mistakes were in our own hands, both before 2010 and during the negotiations, probably.
Well, we certainly, I just put on the table the two things we ended up in the coalition agreement having opt-outs on were tuition fees and nuclear power, and the two cabinet ministers that we were offered out of a very small number happened to be the cabinet ministers responsible for both of those areas. Now, was that a trap or wasn't it?
We did ask for the business department because there's no way Vince would have worked with George Osborne. And if we'd said, look, you know, we're not prepared under any circumstances to consider tuition fees going up, they would have huffed and puffed. But that wasn't a critical issue, I think, for them. And they're so desperate to get into government that was far less of a concern than things like the AV referendum and what jobs everybody would have. I think, you know, we made our own bed, sadly, on tuition fees.
Well, I'll leave that as the last word, because I fear that if we got CULA onto tuition fees, and it could go on forever. So thank you so much for giving so much of your time to this event. It's been really illuminating, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. Hopefully the recording will have worked, and we'll be able to put this up on YouTube so that people who weren't able to be here can listen in. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. We had a lot to discuss, and I hope we can invite you all back soon, either for a virtual or hopefully one day an in-person event in Cambridge. Yeah, Sam, do you have anything to say?
No, it's been really fascinating. Thank you so much all for coming and agreeing to this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's been fun.